Before we kick off the show, if you're a fan of History Hack, please do what you can to support the show. We completely get that not everyone is able or willing to dig into their pockets. Times are hard, but by dropping a like, subscribing on Twitter and YouTube, and importantly, leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, you can help the programme grow and reach more people. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, go to patreon.com/historyhack, where you'll find perks from secret Facebook groups to early release material. If you just want to leave us a one-off tip, go to ko-fi.com/historyhack. The links are in the description. And whatever form your kind support takes, know that we are massively grateful. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. You're here today with Beth and the wonderful Charlie. Charlie, how are you today?
I'm very good, thank you. And how are you, my love?
All good, thank you. And Charlie, who have we got on with us today?
We've got a wonderful guest joining us today. We've got James Waterson. He's a graduate of the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, of the University of Dundee, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this because it will be awful, the University of Fabra in Barcelona. Now, he's a real globetrotter, having worked in the Middle East, the US and China, and he's the author of books on medieval murder, jihad in the Holy Land, and China's Mongol Wars. His latest book is a beautiful one entitled The Crusades in 100 Objects, and that's what he's come to talk to us about today. Hi, James.
Hiya. I mean, obviously, I'm going to try to plug every other book, but this is the one at the minute.
Please do. This is a safe space.
Absolutely. So obviously the title is pretty self-explanatory for the book, The Crusades in 100 Objects. I was having a look at the cover of it. It's a beautiful cover as well. We do like a good book cover here on History Hack. And some of these objects go back before you'd expect, maybe prior to the actual crusading period. So one of those is the Trajan's Column. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it got into the book?
Yeah, it's there partly because things are made of wood. Essentially, siege artillery in the medieval period, we don't really have any obviously original pieces anymore. And I faced the same problem when I wrote about the Song dynasty and the Yuan dynasty and the Jin dynasty in China. Obviously, weaponry then was made of iron, but in fact, if you want to know anything about Chinese weaponry, you have to go back to the Han dynasty, because then it's made of bronze and it doesn't rot. So the Trajan's Column is great because it shows very clearly those large quarrels or crossbows that are used in siege artillery. It shows you the tormentums with their wine glasses and so on, and it shows you the very simple kind of trebuchets or mangonels that the Crusaders would have taken in 1099. Because the other thing that is really important about this, and you've got to feel sorry for these guys when they're facing up to Byzantine built cities like Nicaea, is they're essentially bringing siege artillery that hasn't evolved in such a long period of time. I can't even remember when Trajan died. Any guesses from the audience? It's around 200 AD, and it's around that kind of time. No, it's not as late as that. Anyway, in over 1,000 years, nearly 2,000 years, over 1,000 years, this hasn't changed, right? So these guys turn up. And what I think we do know is that a lot of the time, these very small scale mangonels that were brought with Crusaders to try and tackle a city with such thick walls as Nicaea and triple walls in the case of Antioch, a lot of the time they're using biological warfare, right? They're throwing dead bodies in there, they're throwing dead horses in there, they're tormenting a little bit with it. But essentially, there's no way that those walls are going to be coming tumbling down with the kind of hardware that they took with them. So that was really the reason for putting Trajan's Column in there. And again, you'll find when you look at the book that there's a great big spread, as you say. That's probably the oldest thing, I think, pretty much in the book. But then equally, we've got some things about Prester John and the modern interpretations of that myth and so on. And what I wanted to do was not focus absolutely on the period, but look how things change over time, things evolve, because the Crusades, if nothing else, are an immense body of ideas and an ethos in itself. And that changes over time. And I hope that the objects that were selected for the book really indicate that as well. And I've tried to be chronological with the story, but as for me, the book is as much about the counter-crusaders as it is about the Crusaders. And you will find that a huge amount of the objects in the book are also from the Near East. They're from the Islamic side. Arguably, that's actually, I know far more about that than I do about Western Crusaders, to be frank, although I'm changing my direction week by week. And we're looking again also now at what happened to the Crusade ethos. How did it become things like the Order of the Dragon once the Europeans were beginning to have to defend Christendom against the invading Ottomans? What happened with those other orders like the Order of the Garter, for example? What did that actually take from ideas of Knights of Christ, changing that to really perhaps more of a loyalty to a monarch or a loyalty to a smaller established group of nobles and so on? Because crusading loses its way as well. I think that's another part of the objects in the book that we try to tell the story with as well. Enough of Trajan's column. Is that enough of an answer?
This is really interesting because you brought it into my wheelhouse, the Order of the Garter and much later. But I am going to bring us back to the crusading objects, and I'm going to mention our boss Alex. So one of her favorite traveling experiences that she's told us about, and she said we could not talk to you without asking you about this. One of her favorite travel experiences was she took a road trip through Andalusia, and the big surprise there was Cordoba. And again, I apologize if I've pronounced that wrongly. So why does the mosque that's there make it into the 100 greatest crusading objects?
There's a whole bunch of reasons. The first thing to say is, yes, when I went to university, to the School of Oriental and African Studies, I intended to study Chinese history. But of course you do 101. So we did African, we did Near East, we did South Asian, and we did Chinese. And suddenly Islam smacked me between the eyes, and I thought, this is the one. And the Mosque of Cordoba was one of the reasons why. Because when you think, what the heck is this thing doing in southern Spain? This is just incredible. And it's so beautiful. The other thing was that our professor, the late, great Dr. David Morgan, great Mongol author, but also he was actually a Crusades historian before he attended the School of Oriental and African Studies, and his PhD was on the Mongols, who again, you can't avoid in the Crusades period. And as Dr. Morgan would have said, you can't avoid the Mongols anywhere because they're everywhere. But he actually said to us as undergraduates, he said, listen, you guys, you're broke. You have no money whatsoever. You can't get visas very easily for the Middle East. Go to Spain. So, of course, we all went ragtag down to Spain. You bum around for a bit. It's fairly cheap. And then this thing, again, hits you between the eyes. The other thing is noticeable, though, is object number one, because let's say the very poorly named Reconquista, because let's basically be frank, it was mostly knights from Navarre and northern Spain that were actually trying to push the Muslims out of Spain from pretty early, predates the First Crusade. And I think that was why it was so important for me to say, well, yeah, the First Crusade is exceptional. It's beyond the borders of Europe, but there is a growing and evolving process, an increasing confidence in Western Europe in this time. There's also quite a lot with the papacy beginning to take control of operations, the most sophisticated bureaucracy, obviously, in Western Europe at that time as well, after the reforms of Gregory and Clermont and so on and so forth. But that was why. And also, there's actually quite an early poem placed in there in Cordoba about how sad it was for the Muslims to be starting to have it to realize they were going to have to give this up, that they were actually losing against these barbaric, in their eyes, I guess, Western knights that were going to take this from them. And that's really a number of reasons why I put it there. And also, of course, as an object, it is just spectacular. I mean, I think I look back at my old pictures and they're all grainy and a bit rubbish, probably taken with a throwaway camera or something. And then I was able to go back a few years ago. Actually, I was there for my day job. And of course, now you can take panoramics and you can get all of the horseshoe arches and all of that. The other thing as well is that confidence that came about in Western Europe and that advance from literally through the 11th century, a lot of that is built on Jewish and Arabic learning imported through Spain. And we don't see that kind of interface or that kind of changing, sorry, that's not really the right word, exchange of ideas. It doesn't occur in Palestine. There it's very much confrontational. We do see some objects that cross, for example, from Mosul, great Arabic metalwork from there into the Crusader lands. But to be honest, most of the channels of communication, friendly communication, between Islam and Christendom take place either in southern Spain, with that transfer of ideas and learning, and we all know, how algebra comes into Western Europe and so on, but also Venice and Egypt, with direct trade and direct import of metallic objects that could then have local family names added and so on and so forth. This was not a conquest type process. We find in Palestine very little transference of ideas. And that's quite sad, actually, for both sides. The Muslims were completely uninterested in Western culture. They possibly could have gained a little bit from it, but equally the other way, the knights and ladies, we talk about soap, I think, a little bit later in the book, are very, very interested in the objects from the West. What can they gain? Things like pajamas, candy, all these lovely luxuries, but they're not particularly interested in an intellectual approach to Islam, which did take place, oddly enough, in Spain. So I think that's why it's number one. So many reasons to put it in there, and it just looks fabulous as well.
Absolutely. And obviously that's a very, very grand, as you say, it's number one, the Mosque of Cordoba. It's so grand, and I've never seen it in real life, but my sister went there and the pictures just look fabulous. But there's plenty of obviously much smaller objects, because obviously you've got your large out there, but you've got your small everyday as well. And you've got something in the book called, I have to say if I can get this right, is it naphtha grenades? What are they?
Napalm. Napalm. It's medieval napalm. Or Greek fire as well. In fact, I think there is even a picture of Greek fire being delivered from a ship when the Byzantines were trying to reclaim control of the Eastern Mediterranean. One of their favorite weapons was either to shoot naphtha under the waves, or they could shoot it from tubes at the front of ships, in a great big competition with Venice, of course, but also with the Islamic navies as well. But naphtha is fun stuff. It's made from a lot of dolphin fat. There's a list of about 35 different ingredients in it. I presume most of it's to make it sticky and also to make it really difficult to extinguish. There's a lovely story about the gentleman of Damascus. That's all we know. We don't know his name. He turns up at the siege. Now I have to get this right. He was at Acre. He was at Acre as the Third Crusade was arriving on the shores, as the Crusaders were attempting to retake the city. We had this very strange situation of Acre having an Islamic garrison, then being surrounded by the Crusaders. Then they were surrounded by Saladin, and they were trying to break into Acre because obviously then they could start to get supplies and support in. And eventually it did fall to the Crusaders. But this gentleman of Damascus, he's listed very, very mysteriously in the Chronicles as being a hobbyist. And his hobby was pyromania, by the sound of it. and his friends actually tried to talk him out of this hobby. They were saying, this is pretty daft what you're doing and all this. And he said, this is a harmless hobby. It does no harm to other people. Well, it did a heck of a lot of harm to a lot of people in Acre, because one of the things he was able to do was swing blazing torches across the walls to sweep people off of siege ladders. He was able to make literally a flamethrower and shoot people though they were actually trying to attack from their siege machines. But naphtha also has a good history with the Mamluk dynasty as well. This is what I really like about these small objects is we often think about military treatises being the most important and beautiful parts of military heritage. And again, the Mamluks produced beautiful military tactical books about how to deploy cavalry. Al-Tarsusi wrote for Saladin and gave us beautiful diagrams of how to arrange your army with your infantry in the front with sloping shields and then crossbows and so on and so forth. But there also is a fascination in military societies in the Middle East with these kind of technical things, like hand grenades. I don't think you would find too much in any other military manuals around the world about this kind of minutiae. And the other thing is as well that they're so well described that we are capable of recreating them. In the book, what we have there are replicas created in the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilization, one of the smaller, well, not actually one of the smaller emirates, one of the bigger emirates of the United Arab Emirates, but not usually the place anyone goes to. So again, if you folks are coming to Dubai, go to Sharjah instead, because it's much more cultured and civilized and has this kind of thing in it. But again, so you fill these clay pots with naphtha, you light the fuse and you throw it. The other thing we know is that the Mamluks, for example, they would have small darts loaded with naphtha. They'd have a tube mounted onto their bow, and then they could fire 5 or 6 of these darts across the battlefield, showering. I mean, it'd be like, what is that thing we call it now? Is it a smart bomb? No, it's not a smart bomb. It's a cluster bomb. That thing, I think it's been banned, doesn't it, on the Geneva Convention because it's so deadly. But Robert of Joinville, when he was with Louis IX, and he was trying to take Damietta from the Mamluks, he describes how an entire, I think he actually describes it as a patch of land worth a day's work. Well, that's quite a lot of plowing, right? That's quite a big area, completely covered with fire darts, and that even the Templars were retreating in front of this firestorm that you were capable of laying down with this naphtha. So pretty deadly stuff, particularly not a harmless hobby at all. But I think that these are interesting. And also in the book, there is probably the most beautiful hand grenade I think I've ever seen in my life. It looks a little bit like the German hand grenade with the handle on it. You know, what did they call them? Stick grenades?
Yeah.
But this one's engraved.
Of course.
What is essentially a bomb. They've got a lot of work to make this thing beautiful. I don't know, maybe it's maybe it was an ornamental piece, I don't know, but it's quite magnificent from around 1335, 1400 maybe. A little bit later than the Crusades period, but the Mamluks are so central to that period as being the nemesis of the Crusaders that I really had to have this thing in. It was quite beautiful. For a bomb, it was a thing.
Yeah. It sounds amazing. I mean, my upbringing in Monty Python just makes me think of the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch. The sort of beautiful hand grenade. But that brings us very neatly on to our next question through Monty Python, of course. You can't have got through writing this book without coming across some relics. So which relics made it in? Have you got anything good you can share with us?
Which relics made it in? Well, I think the most magnificent setting of a relic is Bruges. I really love that chapel. And again, I was lucky enough. It's very difficult to get in because it seems to have very limited visiting hours. And of course, it's the file of Christ's blood, believe it or not, as you wish. But again, I think it's related to that idea in Western Europe that we are the chosen people now. We are like the new Israelites. And I think that is part of the evolution of the crusade. Rather than going to Jerusalem, rather than actually undertaking armed struggle to retain it, it's fairly obvious that Jerusalem is lost after 1225, despite Frederick's strange crusade to reclaim it for a few years. After the destruction of the Latin kings by the Quaramisians, it's pretty much obvious that this is going to be a tiny little strip of land, all based around Acre. Jerusalem is gone. Then, of course, slightly later, Jerusalem becomes far too difficult to actually travel to. And you start to see this internalizing of religious thought. And again, that was something I really wanted to bring through these objects in the book as well. This change in the ethos, this change in the ideals of what crusading actually meant. Of course, later on, Europe is on the defensive, right? It's actually fighting the Ottomans in the Balkans. Mehmed has taken Constantinople in 1453. He's claimed to be the Holy Roman Emperor, that he has more right to it than the German Emperor. And this is a really big challenge. So that question of identity that is so massive in the Middle Ages, which is wrapped up with religion, actually comes through with the relics as well. So that gathering in. There was actually also, I can't remember which writer it was now that was saying it was very, very important. And again, I know you've had somebody talking about the Fourth Crusade on this show before, that relics should be gathered from the schismatic Greeks and taken back to the true church, because they had no right to them, right? These guys are schismatics. They're not followers of the correct Holy See. So these relics that are so vitally important and so valuable should be here right back in Europe. And you see that in a lot of places. You see that in Karlstein with Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, building the Jerusalem chapel inside his castle. You see it in Bruges with the file. You see it with Louis IX taking the crown of thorns back to Notre Dame. Thank goodness it survived the fire recently. Somebody dashed in and rescued it. That was really close. Whether we believe it's the Holy Crown of Thorns or not, it's academic, right? It's really about the beauty of the way that it's being preserved in crystal, that it's presented, and what it really fundamentally means. Jean Cocteau was right. Over time, history becomes myth, myth becomes history. They're so wrapped up in each other. And I've found, again, whenever I've written about particularly military societies, this lore, and I say lore because my pronunciation, so about L-O-R-E, is vitally important. It's vitally important with the idea of the assassins, for example, as a sect. It's vitally important to the Mamluks, this idea of steppe tradition, of defeating the Mongols, of creating what is the word, amour propre, you know, what your feeling of self being in the field. And I think Western Europe goes through that process really significantly during the Crusades period. And equally, of course, there's a decay of the importance of big shock monarchs and knights and kings who go on crusade, because they're defeated by the Hussites out there in Bohemia. They have a really tough time of it against the Cathars as well down there, and against the Ottomans. So many crusades failed. Nis, Nicopolis, Varna, they're all abject failures essentially, although I have some sympathy with Jonas Hunyadi. He came close many times, but a grinding war was really the way to defeat the Ottomans. And it becomes very obvious that the Crusades, the Crusader kings who only stay a few months in the Holy Land or are interested in death or glory down there in the Balkans are essentially useless. You need professional military, you need artillery, you need to grind out the victories, and you need to stretch the Ottomans out. And it's the same, I think, you know, the death of chivalry, I think I actually called one of the chapters that, because that's the other thing that we see in this period. The Crusades ethos perhaps moves to the sailors, right? Those that go out globally. I think I even used the line, the Crusades went global, because you've got this idea again of a God-given right to conquer South America. The Pope carves up South America between the Portuguese and the Spain because it's their right. You know, we're Western Christians. I'm not saying anything about the morals here. I'm just saying, I'm trying to understand the mentality. And again, I think objects really help us with that.
Absolutely.
One of the objects towards the back end of the book, again, is carved ivory from Benin, and it's Portuguese sailors as seen by the natives in a carved salt cellar. And again, it's just that idea that the ethos is still there of the right to crusade, but it's a totally different ball game, so to speak. Jerusalem, I think, loses its importance fairly early, oddly enough.
I mean, I'd argue we're still seeing that today.
Yeah, the mentality
times, and yeah,
for sure,
absolutely. And some of your objects are quite interesting in the fact that there's elements of, are they in the right place or so? And like there's the horses at St. Mark's at Venice, which is obviously, you know, probably one of the most photographed buildings in the world. St. Mark's, Venice, the horses, the tower, it's fantastic. But the horses, they shouldn't be there, should they? They're not, or there's been times where they haven't been there and have been there and so on.
I think the Venetians would argue that they should be there. I mean, again, let's not talk morally, because otherwise we'll get hate mail, I'm sure. But I'm sure if we went around the world attempting to return objects to their rightful owners, we would never get on top of it, really. I don't think Istanbul's ever getting these horses back. Let's be perfectly honest about that one. I think the Italians should perhaps be allowed to keep them as compensation. I was walking down a street in Florence about a year ago, and there was a sign in a window of a shop that said, "We really love the French people, but Napoleon was a thief." So, you know, these things go on. This translocation of objects really does go on quite rapidly. But what they really signify is something that Donald Queller wrote about in the 70s, in 1974, his book on the Fourth Crusade. And he said one of the motivations was certainly relic collecting. There was a fever amongst Western Europeans at this point. And I think, and again, we've already talked about the Crown of Thorns and Bruges. But what you're also seeing is, and again, there's some of these objects in the book, you're seeing these beautiful rock crystal carvings from Fatimid Egypt that are then having filigree added to them in Europe to make them even more beautiful. Although, personally, I think the rock crystal looks better without the filigree, but it depends what your taste is. But if you're a West European French prince, you probably want to have a little bit of added color and a little bit of gold and a little bit of metal there. And of course, then The finger bone is in there, the tooth is in there, the piece of St. Andrew, or choose your favorite saint, and put in there. And again, I think that motivation was very, very important, that these objects should be saved from the schismatics. And in fairness to the Fourth Crusade, they didn't know it at the time, but it probably wasn't that unwise, because, who's coming up the road? The Mongols are coming, destroying everything in front of them. It's probably a good idea to save these things and bring them into Western Europe and keep them safe. So I don't think Istanbul's ever getting them back. The Hippodrome is not that impressive in Istanbul anymore, of course. It's a nice walk, but there's not much else to see, whereas St. Mark's, they do look pretty good up there, I think, to be quite honest. Again, but it's not just looting. There's a lot of purchasing going on as well. There's a great business in relics selling right across. I think I can't remember how much Louis IX paid for the Crown of Thorns, but he paid a lot. And I think he actually bought it from the Latin emperor, who was so broke during that short period of 1204 to 1261, when you had the Latin Empire of Constantinople. So it wasn't all looting, but they're not getting them back for sure. And I think that the other thing that this indicates is how central the Italian maritime republics are to the Crusades as well. I've written about this before in another book called Sacred Swords, which originally started out to be a complete history of Genova, Pisa, and Venice, and the competition between the three. The publisher twisted my arm and said, you really need to talk about a few more things as well here as well. And it turned up, and I think we'll probably end up talking about him today. You end up in that period, you always end up with Saladin as being the center of any book. You end up, before you know where you are, you've written 150 pages on the Sultan, and you think, oh my God, what have I done with this book? It's supposed to be about Venice. But there's plenty in there about Venice, because that technological revolution that took place, particularly in Venice, the speed of being able to build boats by rib building rather than the old, very laborious planking that the Muslim navies were still doing, meant that they could put so many ships in the sea. But they were also brave. They had a tremendous amount of land. They would sail in winter. They had an advantage, perhaps, because the current tends to flow east across the Mediterranean, so they could sail much easier into the coast and then cut into the cities than those defenders, the Fatimid navy, generally, and Saladin's navy later on. But they were also prepared to take the risk and the gambles. And I think maybe that's their payoff. They get four there's 8 of them actually, isn't there? There's 4. The real 4 are inside. The 4 on the roof are fake, right? So.
Amazing. Well, look, almost as if we prepared for this conversation, James, I do want to ask you about Saladin now. He's obviously a towering figure of the Crusades. So what did you include in your 100 objects relating to him?
So many things.
What percentage?
There are greater historians than me that have fallen under the Saladin spell. It's just one of those things that happens. H.A.R. Gibb, who was probably one of the greatest historians of the Crusades period, he was an absolute Saladin junkie, and I'm the same. Sometimes I feel like I'm a very poor historian because I'm like, a fan. I remember reading a paper by Ehrenkreutz, who's very, very good on the Navy, actually, in this period. He's a very, very good historian, but he's so rude about Saladin. I almost refuse to read anything more by Ehrenkreutz ever again, because he called him a usurper, all sorts of terrible things, an opportunist, somebody who abused the Holy War. But for me, this is the central character of the Counter-Crusade. He obviously has a great name in the West because of Dante and so on and so forth. And I think we might come back and think about that a little bit later. But still today, so in the book, you've got a propaganda movie poster from 1963, Saladin and the Crusaders, which has a sort of a double-edged thing here, because Nasser, the then leader of Egypt, was really desperately trying to associate himself with Saladin, because obviously he wanted to be number one man in the Middle East. He was trying to encourage Syria into a union with Egypt. He was having a dirty war in Yemen that was going incredibly badly at the time, and he really wanted to present himself as the anti-Western. We all remember, obviously, the Aswan Dam funding, and then, of course, the Suez crisis, and this was great for him, Of course, he met his comeuppance in 1967, unlike Saladin, who went on to an unrivaled series of victories. Although, again, as I mentioned in the book, Saladin for me is not a great battlefield general, but he is a fantastic war leader. And I think that's why you see him in that movie poster. You also see him in smaller art house movie posters where he has become a symbol of resistance in the Middle East. I'm not terribly sure what that resistance is against. Sometimes it's against corrupt government. Sometimes it's against, obviously, the Israeli presence in the Middle East. Again, images and relics and products of an individual like this can be used in so many different ways. But it's very interesting that he's often seen as a symbol of resistance against corrupt government, because I think that's the other thing. He wasn't just a great war leader. He morally rearmed Islam. Jihad is a very complex process in Sunnism, which requires just law. It needs to be pan-Islamic, so you need to bring many allies together, which is why he spent so much time with, let's call it conquering, but in some ways it was wrapping in Aleppo, Mosul. He even talks about the Jazeera. He uses a play on words about this little Jazeera will be the Jazeera that is the lever to bring about the great island of Islam, i.e. get rid of the Crusaders, push them into the sea, and then we'll have one place. So again, this great moral leadership, you start to see it with Zangi a little bit earlier, and then Nuruddin was also called the Saint King as well. But of course, Saladin as well is a Kurd in a Turkish world. And that's the other slight irony of one of the other objects. You've got this statue in downtown Damascus. Well, I say downtown, it's near the secret police headquarters, but anyway, we'll call it downtown for now. It's not that hip and cool and trendy. It's not a straight street in Damascus. But it's a little bit ironic that, you know, Assad family commissioned this statue. It's supposed to indicate right after the Battle of Hattin, you've got a Templar knight at the back of the horse as Saladin is almost riding over him. You've got King Guy looking distraught with his crown on the floor. You've got, I think it's Reynald de Chatillon with a huge handlebar moustache holding a big sack of money because, of course, he was in some ways the cause of the Sultan's anger, so it's recorded, because he was raiding Muslim caravans, and he was also attempting to storm Jeddah down the Red Sea. He's quite an inventive chap, actually, Reynald. He's got a very bad name in history, but I think he was quite a brutal person, but not as stupid as people would suggest. King Guy, I think, was pretty stupid. But it's interesting, again, that this is, given the history of both Iraq governments, I'm very careful to say this, governments, not people, and the Syrian governments, and what they have done to the Kurdish people over the years, there is a slight irony in the fact that this statue is there in the center of downtown Damascus. And certainly Saddam Hussein spent a lot of time trying to associate himself with Saladin as, again, this great resistor against the Western armies. Obviously, Gulf War I in 1991 was a key part of that process as well. But as I say, he's just massively important. You can't avoid him in the Crusades. He's part of that law, the LORE law, that this is the ideal. Walter Scott finds him in The Talisman as that. But also, there's a story that he died with like 1 gold coin and 13 silver coins in his pocket when he died in Damascus, having exhausted himself. And there are some great speeches put in his mouth by his somewhat hyperbolic biographer at times, where he says things like, you know, we are the only army of Islam. Nobody is coming to support us. Nobody is to help us. Because, to be honest, politics at that time in the Muslim world as well was an absolute nest of vipers. Absolutely awful. You know, you could almost bribe the caliph to give you a diploma to manage a city and so on and so forth. So he really does stand out. And I think that's why he deserves. And of course, the other thing is there's 2 sarcophagi. And I think I've asked people, and nobody's terribly sure which one he's in. I hope he's in the wooden one. I hope he's in the original 12th century sarcophagus, because Kaiser Wilhelm visited the Middle East and donated a rather dubious sarcophagus in marble to the great Sultan. I'm sure this was to reflect glory upon the Kaiser himself rather than the Sultan Saladin. But nobody seems to be terribly sure which one he's in. They're right next door to each other. If you visit the Great Mosque in Damascus, if we ever get the chance, of course. Again, given the problems of that country, I was very fortunate, actually. I was there pretty much the year before the civil war broke out, and a couple of times before in Aleppo as well. He's right there and he's central. And yeah, I really hope he's in the wooden. Please let him be.
He is quite the character, isn't he? So you obviously, when we talk about the Crusades, we obviously have an idea of what they are in our head of, Western European Christians going to the Holy Land to save the Holy Land and whatnot. But there's also lesser crusades as well, isn't there? And there's one in particular that does interest me, which is about the Cathars. I've spent quite a bit of time in Cathar country on holidays in Narbonne, Carcassonne, Béziers, all the way down into the Corbières at the foothills of the Pyrenees. It's a beautiful part of France. If you ever get to go, please do, because it's a wonderful part of France. But it's just so interesting. But can you tell us more about the Cathars and how they feature into your book as well?
No, I mean, I know the area you mean, and of course there's Jonathan Sumption. I think he's the best I've read on this, on the Albigensian Crusade. And what he seems to feel is that this is almost like a northern France versus southern France ethnic tussle, as much as it is religious.
Yeah.
Really tells us a lot about what we need to know. And it was quite difficult to choose an image for this, actually, to choose an object for this, because Béziers comes up as the cathedral. You think, oh, well, they put lots of people in there and set fire to it, and they did terrible things. And that famous line that you get, isn't it? Kill them all, God will find his own.
Yeah.
From, I think it's another Reynald, isn't it, if I remember correctly. But for me, I chose the images I did because this was nice material history of quite an interesting, again, religious ideal that travels all the way from Bulgaria with the Bogomils. It changes slightly and comes into Italy, and then it changes into that final form that we know it as the Cathars with the perfects and so on, down there in southern France, where it's really distinctly identified and also quite well supported by the nobility and very difficult to dislodge. But what we also see, of course, in crusading terms is this idea that, again, I don't necessarily have to travel all the way to Jerusalem to get God's blessing, to get papal indulgence. I can stay right here and kill all these heretics. Pope's going to give me the indulgences. I personally do think that there's a small idea. Maybe I shouldn't use the term ethnic cleansing, but no, it's a land grab. I think that's the best term. That's really what I get out of this particular crusade, to be perfectly honest. But of course, it's not just there. It's happening in Bohemia with the Hussites. It's happening with that. There's almost beginnings of a splintering of this monolithic Catholic Church that has been central to the Crusades. We've got what has been viewed by some writers as a captive papacy in Avignon. We've also got, anti-popes and popes. We've got the Wycliffates in England, which obviously then influenced Jan Hus, the Hussite Revolution there. They've got a lot of problems. So maybe they need the crusade weapon really badly internally to quell that, right? I think the other thing as well is that we're coming back to this idea of we are the people of God, we're the new Israelites. Heretics are absolutely appalling and disgusting people, right? Thomas Aquinas calls them as bad as coin counterfeiters, right? Because they rot society, they rot the body politic. So death for coin counterfeiters, death for Cathars. I'm not condoning this, right? I'm trying to understand the mentality. And again, I always worry because I write a lot about military societies and I write a lot about medieval people. And I always try to keep in mind that, I think it was Joshua Steinberg said it, we're no smarter than our ancestors. And also I'm a child of an age where we were prepared to do mutually assured destruction over two ideologies between, whatever you want to call it. If you want to call it Western capitalism for a convenient badge, we can call that, or Western liberalism versus communism. So I'm kind of used to that black and white as well. And we're not guiltless in this in many, many ways. It's very easy to write off medieval people. I find this a lot, this is such medieval activity, medieval mentality, etc.
Oh, yes.
These are actually very complex people who think a great deal about identity.
Absolutely.
So that quelling of what they possibly would have viewed as a cancer within the body politic, within the society, is secular as much as it's spiritual. But the Crusades' weapon, and of course the Milites Sampetri, who are the beginnings of the Knights for St. Peter, or the adherents to the papacy, they're absolutely a great weapon for this kind of thing. And of course we see Templar Knights in southern France as well during that time as well, being involved. And of course, at the time, they're pretty much the shock troops, the frontline religion type individuals. Fanatics, we might call them. But again, as I say, as a child of MAD, that period of history, I can understand it as well. And I think we should.
No, it's putting things in black and white is always a much easier way of handling them and of dealing with them. But the Crusades are interesting because they were fun for all ages. What was the Children's Crusade? And do you have any objects in the book associated with that? I love the idea of these tiny knights. Yeah, please tell me they're tiny children knights.
No, I don't know. I must be honest. I'd almost forgotten about the Children's Crusade. It left very little material evidence is the first problem. There's engravings from the 19th century. And I don't really want to do that. I tried to avoid that very much. I tried to find things that were much, much closer to the events, or things that were, for example, I've actually got a bunch of customs signs from around the world, because customs and excise and duty, for good or ill, comes from the Crusades directly. It comes from the Diwan, it comes from the Arabic word, and that is exactly what Outremer really turned into. It changed from the idea of a messianic community there in Palestine trying to liberate Jerusalem to really an Eastern Mediterranean settlement of Latins making money from customs and trade, with a little bit of religion thrown in. But the Children's Crusade, there's next to nothing in it. And
didn't really happen.
Actually, out material. This is a tricky one. I mean, it's almost a footnote in crusading history, isn't it? It has been suggested it never took place. I'm not sure about that, but Stephen of Clowes, I think, and Nicholas of Cologne, I think these were two main players, if I remember correctly. They stirred up something. And again, there has been a theory that these were not even children. These were lower people of classes.
Okay.
And certainly when I started to think about this, I thought, well, this was pretty much, in 1291, the casus belli for the destruction of Acre for Sultan Khalil was that a whole bunch of rough people from Tuscany had turned up on a boat. There was some kind of incident where a very presumably smooth-speaking Muslim trader had seduced the wife of one of these people from Tuscany who just arrived in the Holy Land and didn't really understand that, Acre survived because the Mamluk Sultan didn't decide it was time to destroy it. It was all over essentially, but it was useful for him, and it would take a lot of effort, a lot of mangonels and so on and so forth. But once these guys, this rabble, let's call them rabble, why not, got out of control in Acre, they started killing Jews over here because they had beards. They started killing Muslims over here and over where. They were causing chaos and causing problems. But again, I wonder if these people of the Children's Crusade were a bit like that, like lower orders, a bit rough and ready, a bit rabbleish. Nobody really wanted to talk about them. There is a tragic story, if I remember correctly, of children being led off into slavery and captivity, right? Mm-hmm. But again, the chronicles don't like to talk about these kind of people too much, really, I think. Yeah. There's also a theory, isn't there, that Nicholas of Cologne, that he was the archetype for the Pied Piper, because again, the children were supposed to have disappeared off, or Pied Piper of Hamelin, wasn't it? Mm. The children were taken off and disappeared forever. I really can't make a decision on this one at all. It seems almost like a peripheral matter. I did mention it at the end because I think Edward Gibbon, when he was writing about the Crusades, really mentions the Children's Crusade as being another damning reason for this madness of the Crusades. Gibbon was not a fan, to say the least. Mm. And it's hard to argue with his verdict when we think about things like this. But I'm not convinced that it was children involved. I mean, of course, people reach maturity very young in this period too, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons for the internecine violence that was occurring before the First Crusade in France was, one, we know there were too many sons, right? Not enough land to inherit. The other thing as well, the extreme youth of people that are involved that don't have such cool heads. I can't really remember when I was young, but I'm sure I did some bad things.
And obviously that we talk about, it's been about the Crusades, and obviously we know when the Crusades happened, but they are still having they are still present in modern society. And some of the entries in your book have had tragic histories in even more modern times, haven't they? So places like the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri, the city of Marat al-Numan, if I've got that right. But again, with this modern times, I think I'll bring this together now. There's quite a grim association with the Nazis, isn't there, with an object as well? So right up to the modern day, there's still a presence of the Crusades.
Yeah, I mean, poor old Marat al-Numan is doubly tragic. Again, we saw what Islamic State did to this very old city. And in the Crusades Chronicles, you've got a choice, essentially. It's quite difficult to decide exactly what happened at Marat al-Numan. You've got a choice between extremely hungry crusaders, absolutely starving on the point of famish, of perishing, turning to cannibalism. And then you've got the version of Robert of Clary who points the finger at fanaticism, that this was a bloodlust type exercise, and this was the fact that babies were put onto spears and roasted over fires and consumed and so on and so forth. I'm not terribly sure what occurs. In fact, in the Muslim chronicles, you don't actually find so much about that for Marat al-Numan. But what you do find, which is quite interesting in terms of the evolution of the counter-crusade, is that you find for the first time Arab townspeople fighting alongside their Turkish garrison. The Turkish garrisons up to this point were seen pretty much as being oppressive. They taxed very heavily. They were very loutish in their behavior. One of the Arab poems, I do use some snatches of poetry throughout the book to try and give that flavor of the time. One of the Arab poets writes that his friends ask him, "Why don't you go out anymore?" And he replies, "When I go out, all I see is monkeys on horseback." So this very much shows us the attitude of urban Arab populations towards their Turkish garrisons, oppressors, and so on and so forth. But what you see at Marat al-Numan is an absolute fierce fight against the Crusaders that are trying to storm the city. The townspeople are even throwing beehives down on the heads of the Crusaders as they're trying to mount the siege ladders. And there's a protracted resistance for almost the first time since the fall of Antioch. So I think that was the intriguing part of Marat al-Numan for me. The damage done to it by Islamic State is so extensive that the other thing comes out, and you mentioned the Mosque of Al-Nuri, is this: we're really, really, really lucky that photography was invented in the late 19th century, because some of the best pictures that we have of many of these structures are actually from that period, because there's nothing left of it now whatsoever. Or if you're in Jerusalem, for example, there's an urban sprawl that interrupts your picture. Some of the images that are in the book of medieval cities like Jerusalem are actually from that period, and they actually show us much, much closer to how these places looked at the time. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely double tragedy there. The other thing as well is that in the Crusades, I think in the First Crusade, it's quite a pivotal event, Marat al-Numan, because there's a lot of authority by the higher lords and the higher magnates. There is a groundswell from the lower peoples that you will lead us to Jerusalem. We're now in control of the crusade. There is a dynamic social change there as well, which I think we start to see towards the end of the book with things like the Hussite Revolution, things like the Cathars and the like, and the loss of power by great knights and great lords on the battlefield as well, because technology has overtaken them at that point. In the First Crusade, it's the fact that this thing runs out of control, but later on, there's actually a loss for the nobility as well. So I mean, it's got a number of things. And I was shocked when I saw the images at what had occurred during the period of Islamic State in that area as well, because I know Syria very well. I've traveled to it many, many times. And it can be, again, a beautiful, beautiful country, actually. Nazis. They nearly slipped my mind. Never forget the Nazis. Yeah, I did want this association, and I knew it would be there without even looking for it, if you know what I mean. It was kind of like I wanted to be able to show how we sometimes divorce ideas like the Crusades from their initial motivations, their initial raison d'etre, and that makes it it's taking the nastiest parts of it. And I think that's why this gigantic Nazi soldier in the uniform of a crusading knight looking towards the east, I knew I would find it without even having to look for the image. I knew it would be there somewhere, because the association is so obvious. There's nothing of the piety of the crusader in there. There's nothing of the sufferings, the immense sufferings that were undertaken by many crusaders for their goal, whether that was as pilgrim soldiers as they viewed themselves, whether they viewed themselves as milites St. Petri or knights of St. Peter. What you end up with is a brutal expansionist project, which is essentially, what the Nazis are looking at. And of course, in their case, instead of Islam, they substitute that for the communist or the Bolshevik East. So that's why our lovely Nazi knight is looking towards the East. And again, I talked about Gibbon a little bit earlier, and I was brought up on Gibbon. And I actually disagree with Gibbon. His verdict on the Crusades was that they checked rather than forwarded the maturity of Europe. But I actually think they were an essential part of the creation of the High Middle Ages and the early modern age, whether by accident or by design. We've talked already about Italian sailors showing great elan, great courage, great ingenuity, great skills. And I think that is, blue water ocean policy of the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, and the Dutch grows out of that. I think also, to be honest, Islam is so incredibly damaged by what the Mongols did to it. I think that, to be honest, the Crusaders were pinpricks on Islam. There were times when Egypt was looking as if it might get lost. There was a time before the destruction of the second wave of the First Crusade by the Turks that there was possibility they may have been able to go as far as Baghdad, but there was a superpower lying east of the Crusaders. And again, we come back to this in the books with the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk and the disintegration of the Seljuk Empire. Still a very powerful force, but much, much distracted with things in the East. Things in the East, when you actually study Islamic history, are much, much more important than the Crusades. But the damage that the Mongols did, also, to be honest, the damage on the coast that the Crusaders did, I think there was a psychological turning in of Islam at that time. Forgetting the Ottomans to one side, they're a slightly different patch, but of the central lands of Islam, it really doesn't catch up with modernity until Napoleon turns up right there in the 19th century. And I think it's a pity that Zach's not on this call, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, I was just thinking that he would have loved that.
The Battle of the Pyramids, yeah, he could probably get going on that one, and so on and so forth. But that's really, I think, one thing that does occur in that period of time. But again, perhaps that Western expansionism is part of that slight divorce of piety and so on, but it is a mindset that we have the right to continue to conquer. And I think you mentioned this earlier a little bit, Charlotte, this idea probably perhaps still pervades some of our thinking as well, that we are God's people, even though many of us have abandoned God, so to speak. This is really why I really wanted this particular image, even though I didn't really know what I was looking for when I went out there. I think we often lose sight about what the Crusades meant to people at the time as well. For me, they were an expanded consciousness of the Western world, for right or wrong, as I say. I don't want to discuss the morals too much, but I tend to take the protagonist's point of view in most of my books. There was a little bit of criticism around of my book on the Song dynasty that it didn't show the Mongol side too much. Well, I was like, well, no, actually, I want to approach this as if I am Chinese civilization facing up to the Mongols, and all the wrong decisions, all the wooden-headedness that I apply is from that point of view. If you've got a limited worldview, you make limited worldview actions. And I think that's very, very important when we attempt to write good history, that we try to write it from without hindsight, so to speak.
Which you can't, yeah, exactly. You can't do that unless you are just looking at the one perspective. You can't actually drill down into why they were doing things if you're trying to look at it from both perspectives, because they wouldn't have that. No, absolutely. And if it makes you narrow a vision, well, that's fine. Because sometimes that's the only way to get focus on an issue, James. I think I'm completely with you. Now, listen, we here at History Hack, we are a nerdy bunch. but we're also a clean bunch. So I want to ask you about a couple of items that did make it into the book and ask you why they are there. So why is Assassin's Creed in the book, and why is soap in the book?
Assassin's Creed. Firstly, Assassin's Creed were incredibly generous when I wrote a book about the Ismaili assassins, in that they gave me a whole bunch of beautiful images of leaping across roofs in Jerusalem and all of that, which I thought was just lovely, because it showed again how, again, to go back to that idea of Cocteau, that myth becomes history, history becomes myth, how they become mythologized. They are dark and mysterious characters. I've done 2 TV documentaries about the assassins on a book that is far from being my favorite. Nobody ever asked me to do a TV documentary on the Mamluks, which I think to me is eternally tragic. Every time I get a call from the TV, it's either them or Dracula, to be perfectly honest. Anybody, and in fact, I'm hoping in September on Netflix, there will be me as a talking head. But in fact, it's the second part of a series that's already run on Netflix called Ottoman Rise of Empire, which in the first series they covered up until 1453. And then we're looking on a little bit further at Mehmed II in the Balkans. So dear old Vlad is there, but to be honest, I'm more interested in Yonatan Yadi, Skanderbeg, and all the rest of these characters. But it should be really, really good to see that. I hope in September it should be out. That'd be very, very nice. So listeners, you can see me in the flesh. It's not a particularly exciting experience, I promise you, but it should be a good series. But again, the assassins, people love them, and they seem to love them right from Dante onwards. Lo Perfido Assassin, as he calls him. And there's a chronicler of the Third Crusade who really lets rip with the old fantasy. He tells us that these young boys that were under the control of the Grand Master, they're taught every kind of learning. Seems unlikely. They have every kind of accomplishment in terms of how to murder somebody. Again, seems unlikely. And they are instructed in various languages. Almost no evidence for this whatsoever. Before being called before the Grand Master at pubescence. That's a lot to pack in before pubescence, isn't it? Before being sent off to murder great lords. And even Brother Ives, the Chronicle of Brother Ives, I do like him because he's one of the very rare churchmen in Palestine at the time who can even identify the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, and he's quite interested in Middle East culture. But even he gives us assassins who are full of the gardens of paradise, like Marco Polo gave us. They're hashish-addicted devotees. There's murderers lurking in every throne chamber, and the troubadours of France love this, right? They come home with these stories. Oh, lady, you have me captive in your heart like the dark assassin, you know, this kind of quite crap poetry, to be quite honest. But even Brother Ives gives us, I think I'm going to have to read this actually, so I've got the book here. He gives us a Grand Master riding in a chariot, riding forth like death, like the final horseman of the apocalypse across a landscape of fear. The old man goes riding, a crier goes before him, carrying an axe with a long handle all covered with silver and stuck full of knives. And this man cries out, "Make way before him who bears the death of kings in his hands." Don't get me wrong, I mean, the assassins are hugely important. One of the reasons for the success of the First Crusade, as I alluded to earlier, was the complete collapse of the Seljuk Empire in the West, this splintering of the empire in 1092. And that comes about because the assassins killed a senior politician, Nizar al-Mulk. And at that point, the Sultan dies shortly afterwards. The Caliph is suspected of murdering the Sultan. The Sultan's wife is involved in here somewhere. There's mutual suspicion. The whole thing falls apart. Of course, you know, Turkish sultans is one sultan, but he's got several wives. So there's lots of sons by different mothers. So they all go into civil war. First Crusade turns up absolutely the perfect time because this thing is falling apart. Otherwise, I think it would have been all over in the first year. They would never have taken Antioch. They would never have taken Jerusalem for sure. Soap, well, it involves the assassins again. I mean, it's also an object of desire in the Middle Ages. I think we've already talked about things like candy and pajamas and silks, all of these beautiful things.
All the best things.
Now, absolutely. But Isabel, the wife of Conrad of Montferrat, who was kind of regent of Jerusalem at the time of the Third Crusade, when Richard was desperately trying to extricate himself from the Third Crusade. Isabel was a bit famous for enjoying her baths a little bit too much, and perhaps enjoying the soap a little bit too much. She was lingering in the bath, so Conrad of Montferrat got fed up of waiting for her. I think he was going off to visit the Bishop of Beauvais. So he wandered out into the streets on his own, where he was struck by several assassins and killed.
All because his wife was in the bath.
Well, we can't be sure. I mean, medieval chroniclers, if they're going to blame anyone, they're going to blame the woman, right? You know, they're all monks. I mean, they're going to blame her. But it is interesting that she marries Henri of Champagne, who is King Richard's preferred candidate to be the king of Jerusalem, because he tried to put Guy of Lusignan back on the throne after he failed so badly at Hattin. Richard really needs to get out of Jerusalem pretty quickly, because Philip Augustus is threatening his land at home. King John's kicking up trouble back there in England, and he doesn't want Conrad of Montferrat. There's also a lot of fault lines running through Outremer. The Pisans were always backing King Guy and Henri of Champagne. The Venetians were always backing Conrad. Saladin may have had another little hand in here as well, not through Saladin directly, but through his brother Saifeddin, or Sword of the Faith. He was quite friendly with Richard, quite a lot of parleying and going backwards and forwards, and they may have got rid of the Conrad problem for Richard by contacting the assassins for him. Conrad had already peed off the assassins as well, however. He had taken a ship of their merchandise, and he drowned the crew as well. So Sinan, the old man of the mountains, the assassin Grand Master, wasn't very happy about him anyway. So it probably didn't take too much for Saladin or Saifeddin to convince him that, maybe go down there and do in Conrad for us. It suits every party here.
Our listeners are going to want to check out the book. So remind us what the book is and where they can get hold of it.
Crusades in 100 Objects is published by Frontline Books. There is a mail order service available. We don't mention Amazon on this podcast, do we?
Well,
we could just buy directly from the publisher.
we can call them the bad place, but I think we'll also try and put it on our bookshop as well, won't we, Beth? Do you reckon we can sort that out?
I'm sure we can sort something out.
Amazing. James, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been so interesting, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
That's great. Thanks so much, guys.